Hey guys, thanks for checking out the DDT Method podcast. My name is Drew Donaldson, and this week I'm sitting down yet again with Mr. Anthony Castor to go over all things human optimization. We'll be putting together some awesome protocols that you can start piecing together and implementing into your own protocols, training plans, peptide plans, and whatnot immediately. Anthony breaks it all down and gives you some killer actionables. In fact, this is such an in-depth podcast, we had to split it into two parts. So we'll be doing part one, the first hour this week, and then next week we'll be diving even deeper with part two, a whole other hour of going into human optimization with everything that Anthony specializes in. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, this is the DDT Method podcast. I'm Drew Donaldson, and this is Anthony Castor. Hey guys, I'm going to interrupt myself really quickly, but I'm going to do it to make two really cool announcements. Announcement number one is we'll be opening the DDT Method exclusive members group. This will be a private community where we can go over things in more detail than we can on YouTube or really any social media platform, going over peptide protocols, overall peptide descriptions and guides, information on how to take different PEDs, utilize them at different times in different courses, and what to do in the background while all this is going on, what type of training to do, what type of diet. This will be an open discussion amongst every badass out there that listens to this podcast and wants to push the limits of their physique and their performance. I'm looking forward to a lot of really cool discussions with a lot of you guys day in and day out, as well as, again, exclusive protocols that I'll be releasing week by week. The other announcement that I'd like to make is that we are launching Real Primal Human. The RPH coaching program is a network of individuals that I've built that are the best and brightest in the coaching industry today, and we'll be bringing you exclusive information as a community and some of the best coaching that you'll be able to find on the planet to optimize your life, from your performance to your cognition to your longevity. I've assembled a team of some of the best trainers on the planet, and we want to help you smash your goals in record time and to do it the right way, taking the bits and pieces of every methodology out there that's intelligently put together and putting together a hybrid methodology that's combining everything that we know works to guarantee you success. Click the link below for more information on Real Primal Human, as well as the exclusive DDT Method group. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the DDT Method podcast. And today, this guy is no longer a stranger to anybody that watches this podcast regularly, and I'm very thankful for that. But I'm sitting down again with Mr. Anthony Castor, and we're going to deep dive into peptides, but we're going to do it on a level that we probably haven't reached yet on this podcast. Now, I know that's a bold claim because we've gone really deep in the weeds here, and you guys tend to love the actionables that we give you from such a podcast or such a format, I guess I should say. So what we're going to do is we're going to lean into that, and we're going to go over some specific protocols, some add-ons, some different things you can do in different settings, utilizing peptides either together in stacks, maximizing their usage, putting them in the right use case scenario. We're going to go advanced here, and we're going to give you some stuff that you probably haven't heard anywhere else, or at least you haven't heard it in as much detail. And this is basically how to maximize stacking and taking your peptides for specific goals. Now, Anthony, we don't really need to give you an introduction because anybody that watches this podcast is more than familiar with you at this point in time. I've been watching you kind of raise your ranking in the industry, so to speak. You're appearing on more podcasts. You're appearing on more platforms. Your platforms are growing, and rightfully so. So we're going to dive right into this, and I'm going to throw kind of like the hot seat question at you right now because it's trendy as all hell. But SLU. Now we're hearing left and right, we need 5,000 milligrams of it. No, we need 500 micrograms. No, we need 5 micrograms. No, we need 80 milligrams. Where do you stand in this SLU debate? Where should we be dosing SLU, and how do we figure this out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's definitely a hot topic. And I'm really excited we can dig into this. I want to start by saying that, as we unpack this topic today, this is based on the information that we have. I think one thing we can all agree on, no matter where you're at in terms of your philosophy on dosing, is there simply is no human data. Now, we do have a lot of anecdotal data, and that comes from people like you and I who are at the forefront of the industry and excited to try these compounds and willing to give them a shot. But full transparency, when you have people like myself reporting results with SLU, there's oftentimes going to be polypharmacy involved, and not even necessarily making that specific to pharmaceuticals. That can mean supportive nutrition supplements, supportive peptides, even devices, things like red light that can boost uh, mitochondrial function. So we really don't have a clear picture. So when it comes to making a decision on dosing and how do we unpack this? To me, I always like to think about no matter what we're talking about, slew or anything, what's going to be the minimal effective dose. And the minimal effective dose is going to be, depending on what your goal is, of course. Let's say you're trying to lose body fat. So if we're saying what's the minimal effective dose for losing body fat, nothing wrong with starting at 100 micrograms. And the way that you're going to measure along the way that you're going to see, is this working? Is this not working? A series of objective and subjective markers are kind of guide you in that right direction. And for me, what I like to look at, I mean, the low hanging fruit's going to be if you have access to like an in body or DEXA scan, and you add in, say just 100 micrograms of SLU, and 6 weeks later, you go check your body fat. Nothing else really changed in your program. You have a pretty good sense of where you'd be in terms of body fat based on compliance to your program, your nutrition, etc. And you're a little bit ahead of schedule. It's reasonable to assume that SLU, because that was the only thing that's different that you added in, is what pushed the needle and got you those extra results. And by the same token, you can look at things like blood sugar. So when we think about how SLU is working, and essentially it's overdriving fatty acid oxidation. So it's really kind of kicking that into gear. If we have something like, um, and I've mentioned it before, I love the Lumen device, just as a quick, easy thing you can blow into and seeing if we've got a lot of beta oxidation going on between like that 1 and 2, or if we're using a lot of glucose, like 5. Um, what we'd obviously hope to see is like a 2 to a 3 shows really good metabolic flexibility. And it's also going to depend on the time of the day that you measure that. So, for example, post workout resynthesizing glucose, we'd expect to see more glucose reflected in the readout you're going to get there. Fasting in the morning, we would expect to see pretty steady stream of like ones and maybe a two here and there, but primarily ones. And with blood sugar readings, same kind of thing. We'd expect good postprandial glucose response. So um, maybe a quicker return to baseline if we're doing like a CGM. But I really, in terms of, I think the most accurate way you're going to measure these things are going to be with like breath analysis. So like anything from Panoe, if you have access to one, or like a simple lumen. Or there's I think it's called Caliber, the little VO2 max thing that hooks up to your cell phone. A couple of them out there, and then just body fat. So then this kind of comes back to the original question. Where do we go on dose? So if somebody's not making progress at 100 micrograms, there are a lot of things that we want to think about. We want to think about, and we touched on this in other podcasts, but I really want to kind of hammer it home. Do we have a stable foundation that we're asking to perform at this higher output? SLU is going to increase activity at complex 1 and 3, which is fantastic. But if we've got oxidized membranes in there that can't handle a higher output, um, it's might not necessarily be that the SLU isn't working. It might be that we're trying to demand more out of our mitochondria when it's not structurally sound. And The other thing we want to think about is, just the basics. Do we have substrate available? SLU is going to increase using fat for energy, but if we're not breaking down fat, if we're too mTOR dominant and we don't have any of that AMPK signaling that's going to help create lipolysis, break down fat, so we even have that substrate available. Again, it might not be that SLU isn't working. It might just be that, we've got this beautiful Ferrari that's ready to drive really fast, but we didn't even think to put gas in the tank. And then, of course, there's going to be that transport. So, is there a problem with the carnitine shuttle getting fat to mitochondria? And then, once we're at the mitochondria, some things that we can't overlook are going to be that NAD to NADH ratio, redox potential, meaning we have an electron to donate to start that process. Um, and that signaling then that happens um, for NRF2 and modulating that antioxidant response so that as that throughput increases, we can continue to manage that oxidative stress and perform at a high level. So, circling back again to the question was about what dose should I take? Some people are telling me I'm underdosing. Some people are telling me this is the right dose. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, there's not a single answer out there. That the way we get that answer is by learning how are we going to evaluate this? What's our goal? How do we measure that goal? And then going from there. The thing I really want to stress too is I read all the animal studies too, and I understand, there's this tendency when we don't have a human dose to go off of, let's just take it from the animal data, do a simple human equivalent conversion. And the reason that this is wrong, especially when we're considering something that um, works through a transcription factor, affects our mitochondria function and can if we're overstimulating it can drive angiogenesis, which is basically what you see in cancer. Not trying to fearmonger people, but that would be a extreme state of angiogenesis. And you could create a sort of like an insulin resistance, and I'll explain that a little bit more later. But when we look at this animal data, what I think a lot of people forget is we're a heterogeneous population. So I got short parents. I'll never be as tall as you, Drew. Um, and we all have different genetics, and mice in these studies they're basically bred to be pretty uniform. We also have, and it's arguably the biggest driver of our biology, is circadian rhythm. When you're measuring these mice in labs, there's no circadian influence. So that's you're not getting that signaling for any of your genes in there. And every cell has its own circadian clock, so it's really kind of cool. Also, when you think about food, we all know that how food itself can affect us, and that if we're eating a garbage diet, we're going to be inflamed, maybe have some bad skin, maybe even have some health issues, achy joints. So imagine if you take that out of the equation, everybody's just eating the same food. And then in terms of actual exercise, exercise that a mouse does doesn't come close to the exercise a human does. And when you think about how specific we can be with the cellular signaling that we get from different types of exercise, that really doesn't take into account that if we're doing a lot of just simple walking, like that's an AMPK signaler, plus SLU, which is an AMPK signaler, plus we'll just say berberine AMPK signaler. So you can see how this kind of compounds compared to if you're just mouse that's identical to the next mouse that doesn't have sunlight, that's eating the same chow, that gets SLU at exactly this time every day, runs on a treadmill, and they try to make some educated guess about its exercise improvement. And um, I guess where I'm going with this in sort of a long winded way is we really have to think critically about this. I'm not saying a high dose can't work. I'm saying that if a low dose works, it just doesn't make sense to me to push the envelope and take the health risks. That you're not holding yourself back for fat loss, you're not holding yourself back for performance. The bottlenecks for those things are going to come from all the other stuff Drew and I will be talking about today around that. How do you maximize these things? Um, as much as I'd love to tell you guys that this is the holy grail of fat loss, muscle gain, and you just have to take more of it, uh, I think in our hearts we know that's just not true. And I think that when we try to just take more and more and more of something, we have to ask ourselves, one, where's the information coming from? If the information is coming from somebody who's trying to sell more and more of it, um, doesn't mean it's going to be wrong, but it means maybe we should take a step back and really think this through. What's it doing? Did I actually get fat loss from microgram dose? And, again, I can only speak for myself and my clients that I work directly with, where I've actually done the measuring and I know exactly what they're taking. And I can tell you at microgram doses, we've absolutely seen impressive fat loss. That doesn't mean that we haven't also had some people that just didn't make progress, but it's not, in my mind, a justification to take those people that I'll go up as high as 400 micrograms. And admittedly, I have a couple people that on their own um, went up to 2 grams and um, funnily enough, still didn't make progress. But um, you know, to me, it's like if it's not working, there's so many awesome levers out there we can pull on. So many other things for mitochondrial signaling. So many things we can do to improve fat loss, improve uh, performance. That why roll the dice on a compound that hasn't been tested in humans, that wasn't working for you at a lower dose, just on the assumption that you need this higher dose because if you convert it from animal to human, that's what it should be.
Right. Now we have a lot of variables in there as you went over. And then again, there's so much stuff that we don't really know about. But situationally, I think people are making a mistake in just automatically jumping from one dose to the other just because it's so much different than what we've ever really had access to before. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean specifically. Let's look at something that everybody, at least everybody that's watching this podcast, is at least familiar with, like Clenbuterol. And obviously, other than being a fat loss agent, completely different. We're comparing oil to water. We're comparing oil to a pencil. They're very, very.
Yeah.
But when you look at something like a clenbuterol, we are aware that there's a lot of individual tolerance, be that from experience, genetics, the size of the individual, just general stim tolerance, parasympathetic or sympathetic baseline, a lot of things that can go into that. But relatively speaking, we know that, 5, 10, 15 micrograms of Clen is generally kind of a little bit, whereas 100, 150, 200 micrograms of Clen is considered a lot. So in most cases, somebody that responds somewhat well to 20 micrograms of Clen, if they automatically took 200 micrograms of Clen, they would probably feel like they were going to die, and they could potentially. And then vice versa, somebody might have an extreme tolerance for Clen. They have to take what would be considered an extreme dose to really move the needle, at least in their opinion, at least looking at it from a prep or a fat loss standpoint. We at least have reasonable numbers that if XYZ does this, then you multiply the dose by this, and then you get this amount increase in effect or this amount increase in undesirable effects, et cetera, et cetera. When we look at SLU, that discrepancy is insanely massive because now we're not looking at 20 micrograms up to 100 micrograms. We're looking at 100 micrograms up to 400 milligrams. And there's, for anybody that doesn't know off the top of their head, there's 1,000 micrograms in a milligram. And again, we are comparing 400 to 500 micrograms to 400 to 500 plus milligrams. So that is a huge jump. So why is it, in your opinion, that some people can tolerate or can't tolerate 500 micrograms, and some people are now slamming down 100, 200, 300, 400 milligrams? Like, why? How is that even a thing?
No, it's a really good question. And um, the best I can do is come up with an educated guess response to that. The couple things we want to think about when we see something like that. Um, One is it actually the real product? That there are no legitimate compounders that are making an SLU inject or capsules that high. So when you get a product and let's say it's got its COA and its HPLC, that's good. And those are important documents to have. But what you're not seeing is, are there metals, excipients, LPS, that kind of thing in there? So it's even more of a gamble when we're talking about those doses. Um, if those people have gut permeability issues, it might not even be really, they might be absorbing only a fraction of that. And when you think about one of the primary things, if somebody's overtraining, increases space between tight cellular junctions in the gut. So, gut permeability in the population that would be doing that, highly likely. Um, then I would also say that when we think about kind of individual response to drugs in general, we have those CAG repeats. And the CAG repeats, what those do essentially is um, it's like this encoding, and um, the length of those repeats, it can be like 36 to 100, um, are going to increase responsiveness to different medications. So, for example, if and I always get this backwards, so I'm trying to remember if it's the longer or the shorter repeats mean that you're going to have a higher response. Um, since I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't want to give people the wrong information, uh, I would just say if you look up CAG repeats, you'll see that that's going to have a huge effect on how you're going to respond to a lot of things in general. So if somebody has CAG repeats that make them the equivalent of a non-responder, that could create some variance in dose. The thing I want to emphasize though is, like, when we're talking about, well, what could go wrong if I took too much SLU? Like, it seems like a good compound and it's got all these benefits I've read about, mitochondrial biogenesis. Who wouldn't want that? Um, Improving um, your ability to use fat for energy, all these things, it sounds really good. The problem is the things that it can do that wouldn't be good. Like, if you're overdrabbing an unstable mitochondria, you can create fragmentation. If you're completely shutting off glucose utilization or making it harder to use when you need it, that can slow things like cognitive function, and even cardiac function to some degree. Um, and in terms of, like, well, where are we going to see these things manifest? Like, because the counter argument's going to be, well, I took 100 milligrams of SLU and I feel fine, and I just lost a bunch of fat. But what you can't project is what actually happened in your body, as far as your angiogenesis as far as your shifts in cellular metabolism. And it's not so much where are you 4 weeks from now, where are you 8 weeks from now. It's where are you a year from now. Because just to give you an example, when we think about breakdown in mitochondrial function, it's a really hard thing to measure with the testing that we have available. And even if you have the right testing, there's still some questions around how accurate is it. But what we do know is, like if you look at kidney damage, that 100% of the time correlates with mitochondrial damage, because your kidneys have the second highest concentration of mitochondria in the body, or sorry, second highest number of mitochondria in the body, behind your heart. And um, things like your liver, that would be the uh, fourth highest um, number of mitochondria, and your brain, third highest mitochondria. And in terms of energy demand, um, number one, both in terms of amount and energy demand, your heart. Um, then you got your brain for energy demand. So, reason I'm putting all these numbers out, all these statistics out, is uh, for these people that are taking these really high dose, because it's a population that works out, and they're going to be inclined to do more uh, exercise, which is great. Their heart is probably going to be pretty well protected, and even if it's taken a hit, it's going to have kind of a reserve, so to speak. They're probably going to have some brain fog, and they're probably going to see, which is ironic with a SLU, but a decrease in kidney function. And if those organs are stable, liver is going to be the next one to take a hit. So you got to kind of follow the dots to which is this person's weakest system. And most bodybuilders, I think in all fairness, and this isn't a criticism, but I see a lot of unhealthy livers and kidneys. And if we're taking something like SLU that's supposed to improve our ability to oxidize fat, that should protect against fatty liver, if we're using the right amount, and it should protect against kidney issues as well. So if we're seeing these values start to kind of regress, and we're doing things that theoretically should be improving them, or at the very least keeping them the same, that's going to be a tell that, I might feel good. I might have lost a bunch of fat. I might uh, look good on stage or whatever, but, um, check back with me a year from now. I'm probably going to have some serious health issues that I'm trying to navigate.
Now, let me kind of go over a little bit of my own experience driving my SLU dose up, because I had some pretty noticeable things going on, and maybe you can kind of put it out there what exactly was going on, and then we can move on to different things like optimizing the SLU doses that we are taking. So my experience with SLU has always been, I'm not a rapid responder to mostly anything, but I can tell when I'm responding well to something. So with SLU, the first time I started taking it, it's been probably 2.5 years now. I started at the 100 microgram, didn't notice really a whole lot of anything at that. And I would titrate the dose up. And then what I would always find would be when I would fall around 500 micrograms, I would get to the point where I don't really notice much of a boost in energy per se, but more so lack of fatigue. I notice that I'm tiring out a lot. It takes a lot longer to tire out during my training. And training is something that, as you know, I'm very, very in tune with. And I can usually pull when something's affecting my training positively or negatively. Now, 500 micrograms, I'm sorry, yes, 500 micrograms would give me a very noticeable increase in fat loss. And just based on my own averages for when I do similar things, it was always a very, very, very beneficial dose. And of course, over time, I would experiment with other doses. 750 for me worked a little bit better. 1 milligram worked a little bit better. So I decided I would take things up step by step, titrating my doses, and I would find that there was a bit of a bell curve. So 750 worked much better than 500. 1,000 or 1 milligram worked much better than 750. I went up to 1250. It was a little bit better. I went up to 1500. It was a little bit better. And I ended up taking the jump up to 2000, so 2 milligrams. And at 2 milligrams, it was fairly remarkable. So at 2 milligrams, it would take a lot to get tired during my training. Fat loss accelerated drastically for the first couple weeks at that dose. So then I thought to myself, well, there's a lot of people experimenting with these doses in the 20, 30, 40 plus, all the way up to a couple 100 milligram range. I'm not really willing to be the first person to try anything, or at least on the first wave, but let me take it up a little bit more. So I decided to jump from 2 grams to 4 grams, or 2 milligrams to 4 milligrams, not grams, 2 milligrams up to 4 milligrams per day. At 4 milligrams per day, I noticed that I didn't get much of an increase in energy. After a couple weeks, I definitely noticed fat loss was moving forward, but I noticed that every day around 2 to 4 p.m., I would be hit with a ton of brain fog. And I would split my doses up to first thing in the morning, then around 1 p.m. And the brain fog was at the point where it wasn't debilitating, but it was crushing my motivation to do anything that really took much intellectual effort. And it was one of those things where I was like, man, I'm just starting to drag earlier in the afternoon. So understanding that I probably wasn't fueling enough substrate, I tried 2 different things. I added in a gram of injectable L-carnitine, and that decreased the brain fog fairly significantly. And I noticed a little bit of an uptake in fat burning. So my progress in terms of getting leaner accelerated fairly dramatically, I would say. Now, the brain fog didn't really go away. So what I did next was I added a substantial amount of food. I brought my daily carbohydrate intake up by about 200, which is obviously a pretty big spike in calories. Now, with an extra, and that was probably from about 250, maybe 300 carbs baseline, going up to about 450 to 500 grams of carbohydrates. Now, at 500 grams of carbohydrates, with a gram of injectable carnitine with the 4 milligrams of SLU, I felt pretty good. And I was like, all right, this is balancing out the negative. However, I'm not a big fan of having to do all this just to mitigate side effects, even though I'm a big believer in L-carnitine. I'm a big believer in just modulating your nutrient intake based on the demands. I don't want to have to do this for this. Plus, I'm doing a lot of work right now. I'm not in a fat loss specific phase. I'm trying to get a little bit leaner. I'm trying to experiment with some things. I don't necessarily want this to be a course of polypharmacy where I don't necessarily want to be having to implement that. So I took those things out. I backed down to 2 milligrams per day. And at 2 milligrams per day, no issues whatsoever. So my question for you is, at the 4 milligram dosage of SLU, was I burning through stuff at a rapid pace, and was I in danger of just almost tiring out the system or just kind of driving the gas tank too close to empty? And is that why the carnitine and the added food helped?
Yeah. That's a really amazing experience you shared. And what's so cool, like, I absolutely love your thought process, like when you went up, why you went up, and having the subjective feedback that you have. And that's really the right way to do it. That's what I want to communicate to people, that in a case like yours where you went up and you're able to notice these things happening, it really lets you zero in on kind of where's my sweet spot. And to answer the question about at the 4 milligrams, what was happening and why did the carnitine work, it's really cool. And it makes a ton of sense when we think about it this way. So remember, SLU is going to increase our reliance on fat for fuel, and with your training and cardio and everything, there's plenty of fat breakdown. But if the weakest link is that fat getting from broken down to that mitochondria, and also the NAD to NADH ratio, so that donation of an electron to start that process, um, then it's a good example that we've got a system that's not really adept at using glucose. So that's why when you increased your glucose intake, the cell wasn't really good at using it, because of the influence of SLU. But if enough of it goes in there, it's kind of like you're going to push in that door anyways, and some glucose is going to get through and make that quick energy the neurons need. So it's kind of putting a band-aid over it. But and this is a perfect illustration of why we don't want to do that, because when we're forcing that door by pushing more glucose in so we can have kind of normal cellular function, cellular metabolism, because we're overdriving reliance on fat and we're under receptive to glucose. Um, that creates, we actually decrease our insulin sensitivity. So down the road, we're kind of setting ourselves up to maybe not handle carbs as well. And when we think about all of the oxidation that's taking place from both over revving the mitochondria and having to force that glucose in, um, and kind of the fallout from that, the brain fog seems inevitable. And to your point, it's like there's always going to be a band-aid or something else you can add to make that system work. But what I go back to is it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, that at 2 milligrams in your case, that was really kind of a sweet spot, like
Mhm.
noticeably better than where you'd been before. Not some of the brain fog stuff. And um, that would tell us that maybe for you, 2 milligrams is a really good dose. And maybe just supporting with a little bit of carnitine, doesn't have to be a lot, so that we keep that available, and kind of doing it intermittently. So we have our days where we're really driving that beta oxidation, but then we also have our days where it's going to be more of a glucose reliant day. So we train that metabolic flexibility instead of kind of an everyday thing. And then when we think about that dip between like around kind of midday, um, that's I guess I'd probably want to know a little bit more about like what time of day did you train? When did you eat your big meal after a workout? Was there high cognitive load preceding that? Um, Anything essentially like so I'll unpack those questions so it makes a little more sense to the listeners. If we know that you worked out right before that, and your body's trying to use glucose, it wants to use fat more because of the SLU, and then we dump a lot of glucose in there. It's just going to be kind of that uh, not optimal response to the glucose that comes from having that higher dose SLU in there. If there's a high cognitive load, we can run really well on ketones. Brain likes glucose. Anything, if you think about like when are we going to want to use glucose, when are we going to use um, beta oxidation, electron transport chain, anything that's quick, like if we're lifting weights, if we're having to think really intensely or just think in general, where there's short bursts of energy, glucose is going to be what those systems are going to rely on most, or their preference. If we're just sitting here chatting, relaxing, that's when we kind of stockpile those ATP from the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. So that's when it would show up less. So I hope that kind of answers the question, or does that give some clarity, or maybe I can.
No, it definitely does. And maybe a way to really kind of break it down for the listener. And this is information that we deal with on a regular basis. And dare I say, this is kind of how we think about even the most simplistic approach to a diet and creating energy. Now, I'm not going to ask you to completely break down and explain the Krebs cycle in an Instagram reel type format, because that would take a lot of fast talking and we'd have to skip a lot of stuff. But can you go over in as brief a summary as possible? What is the process in which we take substrate, we take fuel, break it down, take these electrons, use them, and go through the process of creating energy? How would you, in a nutshell, describe that? So maybe somebody that doesn't understand how this whole process even begins can understand that we're taking things to manipulate it.
Sure, yeah. So what we're talking about essentially is that electron transport chain. And if you think about it as a bus route, and the bus is going to be electron, and it's literally getting, we're creating energy when it drives through there. So with complex one, we're feeding electrons into the chain, and we're going to pump 4 protons. Then when we got complex two, just think about complex two, and that's where the Krebs cycle comes in. It's like this on ramp to the freeway. And the short story, without going into overwhelming detail on the Krebs cycle, is got to have glucose for that to work. um, and then when we think about complex three, that's going to transfer electrons and pump another 4 protons. Um, then when we think about complex four, electrons are going to oxygen that final acceptor. We got another 2 protons. So together, this is building. When this happens, these protons, it builds a proton gradient, and that's like the membrane potential, and that's what drives the ATP synthesis. So, um, to give some examples, like what's this mean? Because I know that sounds like just made everybody go back to biology or chemistry. When we have too much flux through like complex one, three, or four, our body's going to try to figure out a way to quell some of that so we don't have reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species essentially would oxidize the phospholipid membrane in there. And just think about that as like drawing out concrete and getting cracks in the pavement. But in this case, it's supposed to be a fluid membrane uh, that we need for those electrons to pass through. So when we overactivate complex one, three, four, we get this hyperpolarization of the mitochondrial membrane. That potential gets too high. Then we also end up with this, it's like an electron backlog. And when those electrons back up, they start to leak. And then from that leaking of electrons, that creates more reactive oxygen species from complex one and three. And then that creates this redox imbalance. What's happening is the NADH stays oxidized too quickly, and then the NAD pool expands. But the metabolic intermediates like glycolysis and the TCA, and when we're talking about TCA, that's the Krebs cycle, citric acid cycle. That's our express on ramp to complex two. So it gets bottlenecked. And then when we think about to unpack that a little bit more and tie this in with the brain, our neurons are going to be uniquely sensitive because they require continuous ATP. And the reason they require that is for these ion gradients. We've got like sodium, sodium, potassium, ATPase. And when they have high mitochondrial density in the synapses, they're really uh, energy dependent. Then the reactive oxygen species can easily damage these neurotransmitters, machinery, and lipids. Because essentially, like when you think about like the myelin sheath of a nerve or cell membrane, those are phospholipids, and any type of fat, can oxidize if we have radical oxygen species. So the consequences when we have this electron transport chain overdrive in neurons is we have this whole energy reactive oxygen species mismatch, and ATP is going to transiently rise, but the reactive oxygen species accumulation and redox imbalance is impairing the enzymes that we need for neurotransmitter synthesis, like dopamine and acetylcholine. So if we take a step back, let you guys digest all that for a second. Um, think right away. If we don't have dopamine and we don't have acetylcholine, dopamine is your "I want to do this" neurotransmitter. So motivation to go to the gym, or acetylcholine. The very first thing that has to happen for you to contract a muscle is release of acetylcholine from the prefrontal cortex into the neuromuscular junction. So if we don't have acetylcholine, how good's that workout going to be? Um, then when we think about some other things that happen, we get this dysregulation of calcium. Overpolarized mitochondria, they just kind of suck in these calcium ions, and this is going to disrupt the synaptic transmission. It's almost like having a car blocking the road. And then what happens, because we don't have synaptic transmission, and just like, on the freeway, if you've got a car broken down and everybody wants to go, people start honking their horns. Well, what our brain does is it inflames. And when our brain inflames, we get this excess of reactive oxygen species. And then that is going to activate NFKB. Not going to quiz anybody on that. And inflammasome signaling. And what that means, that's our brain's immune system. That's, like if you have autoimmunity, how you get inflamed in your brain. If you have autoimmunity, these are going to be the signaling pathways that are involved, and it's going to inflame your brain. And then the network, when we think about the network and kind of what's happening, the brain's just trying to protect itself. So, in order to do that, to cool it down, it wants to reduce the firing intensity. And if it reduces the firing intensity, it literally is going to feel like you're pushing a thought through jello. Your thoughts are going to move slow because your brain is trying not to overheat it. Just think about if you drive a car really, really fast, does the engine get hot or cold?
It definitely gets hot.
Yeah. So um hopefully that kind of explains it.
No, I think that breaks it down incredibly well. And I really think that now that we're in this age of having this new level of advancement and these tools that we can use, it really puts the burden on the educator and the advisor to make sure that they're educated in what they're advising. Because not to say that, anabolic steroids, Clenbuterol, kind of the old guard of PEDs were any less complicated, because you can break all of this stuff down to the most complex level of mechanisms of action and whatnot. But now we're dealing with some stuff that on the surface level is incredibly safe, but beneath the hood is incredibly complicated. So I do encourage anybody that's working in a coaching or advising role in these things, do their due diligence to educate themselves, at least on the basics of all this stuff that's going on as part of normal human biology as it is, because you need to realize that this is the type of thing that we're manipulating. Now, to take a step back, let's go into a little bit of a use case scenario of how somebody can maximize what they are doing without necessarily having to step into this realm of, well, if I drive this up, I have to incorporate this polypharmacy to deal with this, or I have to look out for these side effects. One thing that's been making the rounds in terms of educators putting out new information has been how to utilize different substances, even from supplements to other peptides to the type of polypharmacy they can use from a less invasive approach, just to maximize the results that we're getting. And one of the things that keeps coming up is Urolithin A. Can you describe to us what exactly is Urolithin A? Because you can buy it off of Amazon. It's not necessarily one of these hard to find peptide small molecules. This is a supplement. So what is Urolithin A, and how can we leverage it to get more bang for our buck out of SLU-PP332?
Yeah, absolutely. So full disclosure, I do have a product that combines SLU-PP332 and Urolithin A. And I think after I explain what Urolithin A does and the synergy with that and SLU-PP332, it's really going to make sense that whether you buy my product, I'd love it if you do, or even if you just go buy urolithin A to take with your SLU, like this should 100% be something you do. So when we think about what is urolithin A, depending on our unique composition of microbiome, I think, and I honestly don't remember off the top of my head, but it's a low number. I want to say something like 20% of the people, if we eat things like pomegranate seeds, are actually going to make urolithin A as a metabolite. So when we discovered this and we found out how helpful it is, and I'll unpack that here in a moment, we found out how helpful it is. It made sense, and Nestle owns the patent on it, that this would probably be something we want to supplement. If we can't make it on our own from eating these foods, it's definitely something that has benefit. And where it has benefit is mitophagy and cleaner biogenesis. So when we talk about mitophagy, you guys have probably heard me talk about fission and fusion before, but just to bring everybody up to speed, I'll run through it pretty quick. Fission is when we have a mitochondria and during exercise, it's working really, really, really hard. I mean, we are kicking the crap out of it, and that's how we get adaptations. But um, it's creating oxidative stress. So we want to mark the parts in that mitochondria that maybe broke down or need a little tune up. And what's going to happen after the workout is we begin the process of mitophagy. And what happens is we get this pink Parkin signaling. Um, Pink Parkin, what a couple names. So pink, what it does is it can't enter the mitochondria during fusion. It can only go in um, with fission. So when pink goes in, it kind of looks around, sees all the damaged parts, and then it calls over Parkin. Parkin's its buddy, and it's like, "Hey, Parkin, we got some cleanup over here on aisle 9." So Parkin puts his theoretical big red X on the outer mitochondrial membrane, and when Parkin does that, our autophagosomes come over and they're looking for these red X's because when they see them, they're like, oh, this is, we've got some good mitochondria over here, but we've got some parts we need to get out of here. So, what ends up happening is the bad part of the mitochondria kind of gets sliced off, um, and autophagosome wraps it up, gift wraps it for a lysosome that just gets it out of there altogether. Um, and that's kind of the pink Parkin and fission. Then when we think about fusion, what happens? So just to go back over the order, fission happens first. It's triggered by mitochondria, synonymous with mTOR, or exercise synonymous with mTOR signaling, like build, 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 fast, 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 high output. Um, then we want to have mitophagy. Mitophagy is cleanup. That's get rid of all those bad parts. So we're left with a bunch of these good, half a good mitochondria, three quarters of a good mitochondria, but fragments that are tip top shape. They've survived the challenge and they're ready to join together with another one. So then what happens, and this is fusion, um, those mitochondria outer membrane join together first, and the inner mitochondrial membrane join together. And when that happens, what we have is bigger, better, more efficient mitochondria. And when that process is balanced, it's beautiful. That's how we keep putting on muscle. That's how we keep remaining adept at burning fat. And when it's out of balance, what we end up with is like a bunch of mitochondria fragments, good and bad, from too much fission. Or in the case of fusion, we end up with these at first, they fuse together and they're good, but then they keep fusing and keep fusing. And remember, during fusion, pink and Parkin aren't allowed in the door. So none of those get tagged for mitophagy and cleanup. So we end up with these um, disfigured, over oxidized mitochondria. It's like the Suicide Squad of superheroes. So getting back to urolithin A stimulates pink and Parkin mediated mitophagy. So that whole cleanup process, it's so integral. to the success of balancing fission and fusion. And that's going to have a redox benefit because it's removing these leaky, uh, highly reactive oxygen species mitochondria parts in the and damaged cardiolipin. And that's going to reduce mitochondrial damage associated molecular proteins. And it activates the NLRP3 inflammasome. And then urolithin A also stimulates biogenesis. And the way that it does this is with the cleaner mitochondrial pool, there's a stronger response to PGC1 alpha, which is the transcription, PGC1 alpha ERR programs. And when we think about that should kind of ring a bell right there, ERR. That is exactly the mechanism SLU works through, that ERR signaling and transcription, PGC1A. So when we think about, why are we taking urolithin A with SLU? Think about it this way. With SLU, we can increase beta oxidation. We can exercise mimetic, work out the mitochondria to have a higher throughput. And then we can have our cleanup crew there, that pink parking signaling we get from urolithin A. So then when we take our time to recover and we get that beautiful fusion, um, essentially the recipe book for our mitochondria is going to be all these new, beautiful, well-formed, fused together, no broken part mitochondria. So essentially you're optimizing both the biogenesis side of what you're creating, what that's going to look like. You're optimizing the cleanup side of making sure there's an X on the parts of the mitochondria that are all worn down and would be not something you'd want to have in your when you're making your ideal recipe for mitochondria. And um, yeah, so hopefully that kind of I could go deeper, but I think if as a takeaway, if you guys just kind of understand that um, we want to drive fission to get the parts to make perfect mitochondria, which happens in fusion, and the things that happen in between there are mitophagy. We want to or mTOR. We want to build, and mitophagy. We want to clean up, and then fusion. So it's part of that process.
So it's almost like you're taking the pit crew with you on the race car during the race, as opposed to having to pull into the pit stop to get the crew to work on it. So you're almost combining the two.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to describe it. And if you think about efficiency too, if that pit crew, to build on your analogy, is really adept at seeing like, oh, I can just hear this tire is going to need replaced. They know what to do before you even take the time to stop and pull over. Or maybe it's a simple adjustment they can make while they're in the car in the first place.
That's an amazing way of really breaking it down. That's awesome. So in my opinion, after hearing that, I think there's a pretty valid case to be made for always incorporating urolithin A with SLU, because kinda why not? It seems to be nothing but benefit and maximizing of the outcome.